Shortly after my wife's death, we called for a family meeting to discuss the will, and my son-in-law walked in with an arrogance that announced his hunger. The funeral under the oak had been both beautiful and strange. A small army of neighbors and clients paid their respects while my family rehearsed absence. Raven's coffin smelled faintly of magnolia. The preacher's words warmed the crowd but left a hollowness in me like an echo. I wandered through the reception holding a paper cup of coffee I did not taste, watching Brenda smile at condolences with a practiced softness, Jude check his phone as if the world outside might offer a livelier distraction, and Ashley move among the guests like a man cataloging advantage. He shook hands with clients and directors with equal ease, and each handshake seemed to carry a quiet calculation. There was grief, and beneath it, a commerce of futures. If you're watching this right now, hit that like button and subscribe. I'd also love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, and while you're there, tell me your first reaction to this story. 3 days later, the doors of the boardroom closed behind us. The table Raven had insisted on was polished to a reflective sheen, and I found myself sitting in the seat she always avoided, preferring to sit half-turned so she could keep an eye on me. I imagined her there, measuring the room with that steady glance that had once unhooked a bad contract from my pride. The photographs on the wall seemed accusatory. Bridges we had built, community centers Raven had lobbied for, a skyline that felt smaller without her small, persistent voice. Ashley did not waste a heartbeat. He slid a thin folder across the wood and smiled like one announcing a gift. "James," he said, voice honey smooth. "You deserve rest. Let us manage the company. Let Brenda lead. Give Jude a board seat. It's time." He said it as if compassion and calculation were indistinguishable. Brenda shifted, lips pressed together, eyes on the grain of the table. Jude stood by the window, restless and distant. The papers were straightforward. Transfer forms, percentages, clauses that masked real power with legal warmth. It was an offer wrapped in etiquette but edged with demand. I set my hands on the table and remembered Raven's lessons. Patience in negotiation was not a passive surrender but a way to see the knife before it cut. The question I asked them was quiet, but it landed like a small stone. "Is that what your mother would have wanted?" Brenda blinked as if the name had reopened something tender. Ashley's smile faltered. He reached to explain, to bend memory into convenience. Raven always wanted what's best for the family. He meant profit, stability, ease. But Raven had been a woman who measured life in people, not profit. They had built affordable units when a quick sell would have padded accounts. She had, for decades, chosen the stubborn ethics of a builder who believed every floor mattered. The meeting felt like theater. Beneath polite words I smelled a different currency. Entitlement. Ashley's posture was predatory. His sentences calibrated to make comfort look like compassion. Brenda, I realized, had learned to accept a narrative that made her a rightful successor. Jude, barely an adult in temperament, had learned that loyalty sometimes meant claiming another's future. I thought of Raven's quiet ways, the way she would walk a construction site and speak to a foreman about his family before discussing timetables, how she kept a ledger of favors and small human debts in the margins of her notebooks. She had been our moral architect. Without her, the company risked becoming a ledger without heart. I refused to sign. "We'll consult Jones," I said, because the truth was not yet ready to be offered like a blunt instrument. I wanted to see what would happen when the veneer of civility peeled away. Would Brenda speak up for herself, or for her father? Would Ashley reveal his true plan when the ink on the paper became a promise? The family meeting that night felt less like mourning and more like a reckoning. Before they left, Ashley straightened his tie and offered a final thin smile. "We'll see you next week, James. You'll do the right thing." He clasped Brenda's hand as they turned away, a practiced picture of a family united in purpose. They left with the confident gait of those who believe the world owes them continuity. When the door shut, the husk of silence settled into a new form. Raven's absence was not only a private grief, it had become a contest. I touched the space where her elbow had rested and felt both the memory of weight and the fragile clarity that she had, all along, kept an invisible ledger of her own, decisions and protections I had yet to discover. I rose, knowing I had to search Raven's study for answers before their momentum became irreversible and lose nothing. By the second week after the funeral, the company felt like a stage where everyone had learned their lines. Notices arrived, a formal board meeting called to discuss succession, a press release draft, investor inquiries demanding clarity. Raven had taught me to temper urgency with care, but now urgency smelled like leverage and hunger. Ashley had engineered the meeting with the care of a man laying a trap. He had dined with directors, made friendly calls, and positioned his family as the calm solution to uncertainty. He had become practiced at smoothing ambition into the language of stewardship. A few directors owed him favors. A few admired his apparent energy. When we gathered, he stood and spoke with the cool cadence of someone used to closing agreements. "We need a succession plan," he said, placing documents on the table. "For continuity, for clients, for families that rely on us." He framed his demand as service to the company and as protection for families. It was a convincing posture. Numbers-loving board members warmed to his argument. They wanted assurance, not drama. A few questioned Raven's will, had she left instructions? But Ashley waved those concerns aside, urging quick action to steady investors and preserve timelines. For him, time was leverage. Speed was a tool to convert anxiety into obedience. I did not yield. I reminded the room of Raven's insistence on humane projects, on affordable units when developers pushed for conversions, on tenants we had kept housed because it mattered. "This company does more than earn returns," I said. "We build communities." Those words won cautious nods from older directors who remembered Raven's stubborn ethics. They were fragile allies, but allies nonetheless. Across the table, Ashley's smile thinned. Brenda's face flashed between hope and doubt. Jude stood like a boy who had learned to look for trophies before he earned sustenance. The vote did not happen, but the pressure was clear. Public expectation had been set, and Ashley had placed his bid. After the meeting, I walked a new project site and listened to men who measured success by the safety of their crews and the sound of a child's laughter returning to a completed home. Foreman Miguel told me how Raven refused a buyout that would have gutted the affordable wing. "She said people deserve dignity," he said. Those small testaments steadied me. That night, I entered Raven's study alone. Lavender lingered. Her desk remained arranged. I rifled through folders, contracts, notes, community lists, and found no dramatic codicil. What I found instead were annotations and marginalia. Names she had helped, promises kept quietly. Grief made me both reckless and careful. Some secrets shelter lives. I decided on a deliberate approach. Delay any transfer until the will was certified, assemble trusted long-term employees for counsel, and ask our accountant to review filings for anomalies. I would move surgically and with patience, because haste would be Ashley's ally. I watched family dynamics shift like weather. Brenda took urgent calls in corners. Jude grew more remote, practicing authority before he had earned it. Small anomalies surfaced in invoices and memos. Patterns that suggested profit had started to be reframed as a family's right. I made quiet requests for oversight, calling on the people whose names Raven had written in margins to remind me what we had built. On my pillow, Raven's voice returned. "Protect the work, James, not the wealth." It no longer sounded sentimental. It sounded like instruction. I resolved to litigate, delay, or bargain if necessary, but always in a way that preserved her intention and legacy. She had a way of naming a person in a room and making that name matter. In meetings, she would call a foreman by his child's name and insist schedules honored recitals. Those habits felt small until you watched them change practice. Clients learned that with Raven a handshake implied accountability. She listened to laborers about the long days and to investors about long-term returns, treating both with an unusual parity. At home she kept tiny rituals, a faded red scarf in a drawer, a book of postage stamps, a precise cup of tea. She loved small ceremonies, a neighbor's birthday call, an anonymous casserole. There was a thriftiness to her mercy that resisted spectacle. Where I moved fast and loud, she tended slow and steady. In countless quiet decisions, she delayed profit for people, teaching the company to be patient in ways that paid back more than money. Once, when a contractor proposed cheaper materials for a public housing project, Raven quietly recited the names and circumstances of families who would live there and asked whether we would betray them for margin. The contractor hesitated and changed course. Her method was not grandstanding. It was carefully marshaled testimony that rearranged incentives. She kept ledgers in drawers, favors repaid, anonymous payments, names of families helped. If I teased her about secrets, she said some mercies must remain private to preserve pride. Her secrecy had texture. It sheltered dignity. After her death, those small shelters became questions. Had she tucked formal legal steps among those lists? Had she prepared contingencies to protect people? The possibility comforted and unnerved me. If Raven had prepared hidden instructions, they would be buried among the ordinary. Receipts, hospital notes, a folder of diary entries I might not know to search. Stories surfaced that felt, in isolation, like small kindnesses. Rent for a young mother, a weekend spent explaining mortgage paperwork, a donation left without a signature. Together they formed the architecture of her moral life. I noticed how Brenda absorbed those lessons. Deflecting praise, practicing softness in public. Those qualities could be mistaken for weakness in boardrooms where a polished outsider like Ashley learned how to exploit gentle habits. Grief sharpened my focus. Stewardship required action. I began to document what I saw: calls Brenda took in corners, unexpected memos, invoices rerouted. I asked a foreman to keep me rooted in daily reality and a trusted secretary to watch administrative changes. I moved like someone laying foundation. Small, repetitive tasks, each necessary to hold something larger upright. At night I would sit in Raven's chair and feel the indentation of her attention. The chair was instrument and prompt. I told myself to honor that weight with the fidelity she had shown in small mercies. If her quiet model had guided the company for years, my job now was not merely to resist expedient change. It was to keep alive the stubborn ethic she had taught. That responsibility settled over me like timber. It was heavy, precise, and necessary. He had not been born into our world. He entered through courtship, easy charm, polished handshake, knowledge of wine and investors that disguised how little he understood about a mud-splattered site at dawn. At first he seemed like a breath of modern air, speaking of efficiency, brand, and expansion. Brenda, craving approval, found his certainty flattering. He offered sleek solutions to the messes I defended as moral choice. Beneath polish, Ashley was a tactician. He cultivated allies by flattering them and slipping small opportunities their way. He donated to committees, recommended consultants, nudged reassignments. His memos asked for streamlining, and his recommendations arrived when our attention divided. When grief loosened the anchors that kept opportunists at bay. Subtle reassignments and vendor changes landed with plausible rationale. The profit trail, however, curved in ways that benefited his circle. He bent affection into leverage. He sponsored scholarships in Brenda's name and promised trusts for Jude's education, delivering demonstrations of devotion that doubled as investments. Dinners were half romance, half networking. He taught Brenda to equate security with stepping aside and letting him guide policy. At home his flattery shrank her independence. Jude mimicked him quickly. Posture, speech, the way a single joke can make someone flinch and lose ground. The boy's entitlement hardened into impatience. He wanted titles and offices before he had experience. Ashley fed that hunger with the precision of a man who knew how to convert aspiration into influence. Among staff, Ashley played charm when convenient and influence when necessary. He could deliver a speech about community impact and then arrange a vendor change that funneled work to a recommended firm. When questioned, he framed choices as strategic. He refined predation into a language of mutual benefit that often disguised who profited most. I began to document patterns. Vendor shifts coinciding with his endorsements, memos timed to cash squeezes, and recommendations that boosted affiliates. Each instance was plausible alone but revealing in sequence. If I could point to the sprouting places, his smile would lose its armor. I confronted Brenda one evening, not harshly but with the steadiness Raven used. I described what I had observed and asked if she saw how decisions were framed for convenience rather than conscience. She wept and then quieted. I didn't know, she said, as if the admission could redescribe the past. It didn't change facts, but it reminded me the fight ahead was not merely corporate. It was about rescuing a person entangled in a persuasive script. I would not humiliate Brenda. I would arm her with facts and reclaim the company's moral compass. The work required patience, legal precision, and compassion. If Ashley wished to pick at the seams of our legacy, he would learn that rebuilding requires more than a smile and endurance. Raven's desk looked untouched, glasses atop blueprints, a teacup with an old ring of tea. I noticed a loose board where the floor met the desk. For a moment I stood at the threshold, thinking of privacy and mercy, of how secrets can shelter people. But then Ashley's calm arrogance in the boardroom and Brenda's uneasy smile pushed me forward. I lifted the board and found a cedar box tucked in a shallow hollow. Inside the box were 3 items that rearranged my life: a small lock of hair, a folded birth certificate labeled James Anderson Jr., and a sealed envelope in Raven's careful script. My hands shook as I unfolded the letter. Raven wrote that the infant we believed lost had died hours after birth and that, in the hospital's pain, a nurse offered a healthy newborn. Raven had taken that baby home and raised her as Brenda. Her words were candid about shame and mercy. She explained that she had kept the secret to spare me grief she feared would destroy me. There was also a DNA and paternity report, quietly commissioned months before she died and sealed with a lab stamp. The result was blunt: a 0% probability that Brenda was my biological child. The report felt like a verdict I had no part in yet bore Raven's intention. An instruction folded into statistical fact. Memories rearranged themselves. Brenda's laughter at recitals, her small hands building towers, the way she sought affection. These moments reframed but did not unmake love. Raven's note did more. She warned of Ashley's appetite and urged me to protect the company and the direct bloodline heir if possible. She left slender clues: a nurse's log reference, a name in a diary, a path to follow. I felt both betrayed and grateful. Her secrecy had given Brenda a life. It had also built a fragile castle that could crumble if exposed. If the will required a biological heir, legal truth and familial truth would collide with devastating force. Night expanded as I closed the box. I sat on the study floor with the lock of hair in my palm. Questions rushed in: how to tell Brenda without harming her, how to prevent Ashley from weaponizing grief, whether the truth should be public or preserved as the mercy Raven intended. My grief layered over itself, old pain overlaid with a new, consequential secret. In the cold light of morning I catalogued the practical steps. Preserve the box, make certified copies of the DNA report for trusted counsel, and ensure a secure chain of custody. I also catalogued the moral ledger. Treat Brenda with dignity, verify facts before acting, and guard the company against opportunists. Raven's letter was a map and a plea. I would verify records, consult a lawyer I trusted, and quietly commission an investigator to follow the slender lead she left. I owed her that care. The secret had become a hinge. It would not simply reassign shares. It would demand choices about honesty, mercy, and what it meant to be family. I closed the study door lightly and placed the cedar box back beneath the floorboard, carrying with me the beginning of a new, careful work, to honor Raven, protect those she loved, and steward the company she had shaped. I sat on the study floor with the cedar box between my knees and Raven's handwriting spread like a road. Her script, tender, exact, held a confession. The infant she had carried with me lived only hours, and in the hospital a nurse had whispered of another newborn, a healthy child whose young mother could not keep her. Raven had taken that child home and raised her as Brenda to spare me a grief she feared would break me. The discovery knocked the air from me. Everything I thought steady about Brenda, bedtime rituals, school recitals, quiet petitions for spare change paid for by her, reoriented. Memory did not vanish. It simply acquired a new frame. Raven's honesty did not erase decades of love, but it introduced a legal fact she had anticipated. Enclosed was a paternity report Raven had quietly commissioned. Clinical stamps, a lab header, and a blunt finding: 0% probability that Brenda was my biological child. Also tucked in were initials of a nurse, a ward log reference, and a torn journal page with a woman's penciled name. Raven had not left merely admission but a path. Evidence to follow, people to contact. Her letter read like strategy written in grief. She named Ashley and described his soft politeness that hid appetite. She warned he would see her death as a ledger to be claimed and urged me to protect the company and the child's dignity. Tell her gently, she wrote, and verify before you act. There was practical mercy threaded through her shame. I felt two currents: betrayal and gratitude. Betrayal at the secrecy and at a system that made a nurse's whisper possible. Gratitude for a life Raven had given Brenda. The collision left me raw. How do you reconcile love with a truth that reshapes identity? Raven had asked me to be both guardian and executor of a secret she had carried alone. Practicality intervened. I locked the cedar box and listed steps. Call Jones Robin, obtain certified copies of the DNA report, locate the hospital archivist. Hire a discreet investigator to track initials and diary references. Secure chain of custody for the evidence. I would not fling this truth like a stone. I owed Brenda tenderness and fairness. Raven's motive softened my anger. She had chosen mercy in a ward full of grief, and likely no option seemed clean. Her secret was an attempt to preserve life at the cost of truth. That made the choice harder: expose the lie and risk destroying what she had given, or keep silence and let a lie govern the company. I thought of Ashley again, already circling. Raven's warning was precise. He would convert grief into entitlement. I did not want inheritance to be reduced to auction. My plan would be surgical: verify facts, secure legal footing, and control the reveal so it protected Brenda's dignity while honoring Raven's instruction. I resolved to commission discrete DNA confirmations for any candidate we identified and to ensure every document followed a secure chain of custody, because a leak could destroy lives as surely as a verdict. I would move with patience and purpose. Mercy would guide my steps through the storm. I promised her, aloud and to myself, that I would follow the path she had left: careful, private, and resolute. He has been my lawyer for 30 years. An unflashy, steady man who translates grief into process. I gave him the cedar box and he read Raven's letter with the same calm he used in contract disputes. When he finished, he looked at me with a focus that removed pity from the room. No theatrics, he said. We follow evidence. He outlined immediate steps: obtain certified copies of the paternity report, secure the cedar box in a vault, document chain of custody, and open discreet archival requests at the county hospital for birth records around Raven's delivery date. He recommended a private investigator experienced with medical records and a sealed subpoena if the hospital's archivist required it. Above all, he warned against leaks. Family secrets, once public, metastasize, he said. We turned to the will. Raven had amended it months earlier with a clause that passed assets to her direct bloodline heir. Jones explained that such wording demands incontrovertible proof. If Brenda is not a blood heir, the clause could shift distribution and invite legal maneuvers. He advised that the lab report alone would not be enough in court without corroborating records: a nurse's log, a midwife entry, or a birth mother's diary. I told him about the nurse's initials and the torn journal scrap Raven had tucked inside the box. He suggested we contact the archivist anonymously and request a range of records rather than a single name. Discretion would keep suspicion from growing. He emphasized we must not confront family until we had confirmed facts. The law will be our lever, he said. But wield it badly and you will only break hearts. He warned with examples of families ruined by publicity and insisted on redundancy. 2 investigators, sealed storage, and logged handoffs with timestamps. He printed chain of custody forms and showed me how to sign. We role-played telling Brenda, lead with love, then fact. Offer immediate care and a small circle of truth-tellers. He stressed discretion over speed. As he left, he tapped his briefcase and said, You will grieve and govern. Do both with honor. That simple command steadied me. I spent that afternoon walking a job site, rehearsing phrases, testing my courage. I thought of Ashley circling like a vulture and of long-term directors who still remembered Raven's insistence on dignity. I called one discreetly, an old friend from procurement, and asked him to quietly monitor board chatter. If this became a battle, it would be fought with facts, steady allies, and with what little mercy I could marshal. No. He attended board dinners more often, sponsored internal seminars, and wrapped his ambition in tidy phrases. Streamline, optimize, position for growth. On paper his moves looked prudent. In practice they hollowed cedar corners Raven had refused to remove. Vendor changes cut costs but also shrank the affordable projects we kept because they mattered. He recommended suppliers who then began to win bids with unsettling frequency. At home, his charm did its work. He flattered Brenda into repeating phrases about leadership and legacy until she sounded like a spokesperson for his vision. He arranged trust meetings and promised titles that would seat her where influence looked official. Jude watched and learned posture. His impatience hardened into entitlement. I began to map the pattern. Alone, each memo or recommendation could be plausible. Together they formed an architecture of advantage. I kept a ledger, dates, suggested vendors, approving signatures, and emails, with a few foremen who had been with us for decades acting as quiet witnesses. Miguel and others remembered Raven's insistence that our work serve people, not just investors. Their quiet notes were more than sentiment. They were evidence. Confronting Brenda would be a betrayal of the life we had made. She had been mothered and loved. But facts do not yield to affection. I asked her questions about changes and watched Ashley's phrases echo in her replies. When I spoke of tenants and community outcomes, her eyes would shift as if balancing loyalty and instruction. It was painful to see her caught between the man who promised ease and the memory of the woman who taught discretion. Ashley was not a simple villain. He was a practitioner of polite predation. He learned which smiles opened doors and which lines coaxed directors into compliance. He converted warmth into leverage. That made him more dangerous than a crude adversary. I moved strategically. I called quiet meetings with long-tenured directors, reminding them of Raven's early choices and why those decisions mattered beyond quarterlies. Some returned to old convictions when reminded. Others hedged. I tightened oversight, requested audits, and asked Jones to prepare contingency plans. At the same time, I tried to protect Brenda. I would not ambush her with accusations. I sought to gather what was necessary to confront decisions, not to denigrate a life. The ledger I kept was an act of stewardship, not retribution. I wanted a record that held the company's values as well as numbers. Miguel pulled me into the yard one gray afternoon and pointed to a delivery ticket. A supplier Ashley had suggested had routed a shipment through a new distributor that quickly cornered contracts usually won by a local firm. "Those men's kids work there," Miguel said. He reminded me Raven once refused a 9-figure buyout that would have gutted affordable units. The nights after I found the cedar box were thin. I sat with spreadsheets, aligning dates, emails, memos, and bid lists until a pattern emerged. The ledger became a narrative I could present to anyone who asked for proof. I rehearsed language that told truth without annihilation, to protect tenants, reassure staff, and deliver news with care. I also thought of Raven's hint that a living heir might exist who carried our blood unknowingly. That possibility steadied me. By the next board meeting, I had a quiet coalition, a paper trail, and a patience that felt like armor. I reached out to a trusted director and asked him to keep an eye on procurement changes. I instructed Miguel to flag any community impact shifts immediately and to document conversations. This granular collection would, I hoped, reveal the architecture of Ashley's influence without resorting to rumor. A shipment had been delayed and tempers flared in the July heat. Ben walked to the foreman's truck, wiped his hands, and said, "I'm sorry. We'll sort this out." He did not send a memo or assign blame. He knelt in the dust and stayed until the problem unspooled. That day he rerouted materials, calmed a vendor, and stayed late to double-check measurements. In a field where bluster often passes for leadership, his quiet competence felt like an unforeseen beam of support. His record was ordinary, a steady climb through field roles to project manager. On paper he was plausible. In the field he was unmistakable. He greeted laborers by name, asked about families, and refused shortcuts that endangered outcomes. He advocated for our affordable housing projects without the theatrics of someone angling for praise. Watching him, I felt something stir, recognition, as if a piece of our company's original spirit had taken physical form. Jones had sent an investigator after a diary name Raven had left. The lead pointed to a young mother and a midwife's note suggesting a switch. Cross-checks in adoption and hospital indexes produced an unlikely candidate. Ben Udemy, raised by working parents 2 counties away and known for steadiness and skill. The hint made my mind tilt, but the law required proof. I could not proceed on feelings alone. Still, curiosity is its own kind of investigation. I introduced myself to Ben on site one morning, claiming idle interest in the project schedule. We spoke about cranes, concrete, and the stubborn compromise between timelines and safety. He spoke plainly about community projects, as if they were moral work rather than PR, and mentioned his pride in teams who stood by a build when the weather turned against them. When I told him Anderson had anchored my life, he nodded with modesty and asked about the cruise day. I watched him after that, not as a father would, but as a man trying to see whether the instincts that had shaped him reflected anything of me. He kept a chipped mug in his office and a pencil tucked behind his ear. He treated subcontractors like partners and foremen like trusted colleagues. His leadership was practical, unglamorous, generous. At night I rehearsed questions I did not have the right to ask aloud. Would he want an inheritance he did not know existed? Would he feel gratitude or betrayal? I thought of Raven and her choice, how she had swapped grief for a life, and how she had kept that life secret to protect me. Now her secrecy had passed to me as a responsibility. Jones arranged discreet, court-approved checks. I insisted that if Ben were connected, any engagement would be handled with consent and dignity. The investigator moved through records like a patient reader. Hospital indexes and adoption logs are not romantic things. They are paper and signatures and slow bureaucracy, but they can reveal truth. I told Jones about Ben and he cautioned patience. He emphasized legal protocol and human dignity. We prepared for a delicate approach, an invitation to a conversation, sample collection with consent, and counseling. Above all, we agreed that if Ben was mine, his welcome would be chosen, not foisted upon him. Days became a hush of small interactions. I found reasons to visit the site. A coffee, a question about reinforcement, a compliment for Ben's team. He never betrayed impatience. He spoke of mentors, of a high school coach who taught him to measure twice, cut once, and of parents who worked 2 jobs. His stories were ordinary, which made them feel truer. If the lab confirmed blood, I believed I wanted it to be a bridge, not a verdict. I wanted to welcome a man who might share my name into a stewardship we could build together. Until the law made the fact clear, I watched and learned the contours of a life that could become part of ours. In the quiet between measurements and memos, I began to imagine a future where legacy meant work, mercy, and the people who do the hands-on labor of making a community habitable. When Jones called with news that archival checks had returned corroborating entries, a midwife's note, a ward log entry that matched Raven's scrap, and a registered admission aligning with Ben's early records, the study seemed to sharpen. The paternity report was no longer an isolated number. It fit into a lattice of documentary evidence. For the first time since finding the cedar box, I felt the possibility of moving from suspicion to legal clarity. We set about securing the evidence with a ritualistic thoroughness. Jones arranged for the cedar box to be transported to his office vault with signed custody forms. He filed for certified copies of the DNA report and printed sealed exhibits that could be introduced during a formal reading of the will. He recommended a court-approved voluntary sample for any candidate identified. The goal was consent and dignity rather than surprise. He also prepared an addendum clarifying Raven's phrasing, her directive that assets pass to a direct bloodline heir, so that the boardroom reading would be grounded in legal interpretation rather than rumor. Preparing the boardroom became a choreography. A small group of long-tenured directors were quietly notified and asked to attend. They were chosen because their loyalty was to the work Raven and I had done, not to a family claim. Security protocols were tightened to prevent premature leaks, and Jones insisted we have legal counsel present to manage any press inquiries. We rehearsed a brief public statement. The company would continue operations. Personal matters would be resolved privately. The board would provide only necessary assurances. I took operational steps too. Jill in procurement was moved to an interim oversight role and asked to document vendor changes. Miguel and Foreman were instructed to log community impact shifts and deliver informal testimonies of historical choices. Each action added to the ledger that would show pattern and motive rather than rely on conjecture. The plan was surgical. Evidence first, disclosure second. There was special care taken for Brenda. Jones argued for legal clarity before family disclosure. I argued for tenderness in delivery. We drafted a private script that led with love and concern, explained Raven's instruction and the need for verification, and offered immediate support, counseling and a small circle to help her through the shock. I insisted that I would speak first. I could not bear the idea of her learning a truth about herself in a public or unprepared manner. The goal was to preserve as much dignity as possible. Bringing Ben into that room required its own choreography. Jones suggested an ordinary pretext: invite him to present a project update to the board, so he would enter unworried. If Ben agreed to a voluntary sample, it would be taken respectfully and documented. If he refused, Jones had contingency language to proceed with the reading and legal steps without overt coercion. Every possible outcome had been mapped with care and paperwork, because law can be a scaffold for mercy if you build it right. On the eve of the meeting, I did small, practical things. I visited job sites, shook calloused hands, and left a thermos for the night crew. I called a long-serving director and asked him to keep the room steady. I told Miguel to be at the boardroom door early. Rituals of courtesy became part of the architecture of a delicate operation. They reminded me that we were protecting people, not merely a balance sheet. I rehearsed the first lines I would say to Brenda, practicing a voice that mixed apology with steadiness, and I resolved to hold her even if the world insisted on breaking apart. Dawn would bring a reading, and with it, choices I had not yet fully faced. I remember the light slanting across Raven's empty chair, painting the grain of the table like a timeline I could not erase. We had called the meeting with care. Jones had advised a narrow circle, long-tenured directors who still believed in the company as a moral project. I felt each heartbeat as a metronome for what would come. Truth, shame, law, the brittle mechanics of family exposed to daylight. Ashley arrived composed, as if control could be dressed and polished. Brenda followed with a careful smile. Jones read Raven's amendment in a voice that kept the room from rushing forward. The clause about a direct bloodline heir, written months before she died. Time folded. Faces made calculations before they understood facts. Ashley's jaw tightened. The directors sat straighter, tasting the clause's import. Not every line in a will is dramatic, but this one had been written like a fuse. Then Jones produced the DNA report and set it on the table like evidence. 0%. The room inhaled as one. Brenda's fingers dug into the wood. Ashley's smile thinned. People react to truth with panic, anger, or stunned silence. Brenda folded inward, blinking away a storm she had not expected. I felt oddly removed from the explosion. Grief had hollowed me and given me a strange clarity, like glass that reflects rather than absorbs. "This cannot be right," Ashley said, voice brittle. He accused me of forgery and manipulation. Jude muttered something I could not catch. The directors exchanged looks, weighing consequence. Jones, steady, cited corroborating evidence. Hospital logs, the torn journal page, a midwife's note. Small things that form a lattice of fact. Brenda collapsed quietly. She did not perform for the room. She was losing more than inheritance. She was losing the story she had lived. Raven had acted in a hospital's grief, choosing mercy. That mercy did not erase truth, but it did demand how we delivered it. I had to be careful. Weaponizing facts for triumph would make us worse than those we opposed. Security hovered near the doors. Ashley's anger ricocheted. Entitlement met denial in a sound that made the room smaller. "You cannot do this," he shouted, revealing a belief that rules bend to will. An old, fierce thing rose in me. This was not about paper. It was about the life Raven had protected and the integrity of the work she had built. Jones proposed next steps with the bluntness of a man who knows how to marshal facts. Invite the possible heir with dignity, confirm identity with voluntary samples, read Raven's will to limit spectacle and preserve dignity. He offered a private script for Brenda and an invitation for Ben to present as an ordinary project update. "Process protects people," he said. I stood by the window after the meeting, watching a delivery truck round the corner and thinking how small moments connect to larger truths. When Raven placed a brick, she thought of a family moving into a home. When she organized a meeting, she measured how decisions touched real lives. Those modest decisions had accumulated into something larger than profit. Now, the legal facts forced a separation between affection and biology, and I had to hold both with equal care. I rehearsed how to tell Brenda without shattering the dignity Raven had given her. I thought about Ben, If he were indeed our son, what would that mean to a man who had built his life in honest labor? Would he want the inheritance that might change his name but not his work? I found myself mapping not only legal steps but gestures. A hand on a shoulder, an invitation to coffee, a promise to listen. Mercy, I realized, was procedural as well as emotional. It required planning and small acts of care. And tenderness. I had expected denial, perhaps a loud protest, but not the way she folded like a map closing. Her face went pale as if light withdrew from it. I remember thinking, with a cruelty that shocked me, that we had opened a small door and could not know what would fall out. People lined up their loyalties the way workers line up materials. Some for structure, some for salvage. Ashley raged. His voice was a saw trying to cut through a beam of fact. He named every accusation he could imagine. Fraud, forgery, manipulation. His words launched not to persuade but to wound. Brenda clung to the cedar box like a child clutching an heirloom. Her whole life rearranged into a set of documents and signatures and a history she had not consented to. She accused me of cruelty at the moment of her collapse. I understood the accusation even as I knew I carried Raven's instruction like a fragile fuse. My duty was not to break her, but to honor the woman Raven had been and the life she had chosen to give Brenda. I remember the sound of Jude's footsteps, rapid, uneven, leaving the room. Entitlement converts away from its source when it finds obstruction. He vanished with a kind of practiced avoidance. Ashley kept shouting, but his accuracy dwindled. Directors shifted in their seats and asked for breaks, for counsel, for time to breathe. The world outside kept moving. Calls, clients. But inside the boardroom time had thickened into a slow moral test. Jones and I moved to enact the plan. Private counsel for Brenda, discreet notifications to a small circle, and a careful scheduling of the will reading. We could not erase the report, nor did we wish to. We needed instead to scaffold a way for truth to land without shattering everyone present. That meant prepared rooms, counselors, the presence of a person Brenda trusted. I picked 3 names, a sisterly friend, a long-serving director, and Miguel, who had watched Brenda at community events and remembered the small kindnesses Raven had arranged. I sat beside her on a low couch after the initial shock, and she let me hold her as though I were always meant to. She asked me how to be a daughter without blood and how to keep a life that suddenly had been reframed. Her questions were not angry at first. They were small and aching, like a child asking why the sun had moved. I answered with a tenderness I had not practiced, telling her about Raven's choice, not as accusation but as confession of love. The story did not fix her, but it offered context for a mercy she had never known to question. I arranged private counseling and asked Jones to draft a discreet statement for employees if necessary. The company had to continue. Tenants still needed roofs and families needed stability. Rumors began to drift, an idling car, a whispered tip, but Jones limited public words to continuity and process, buying time. Even so, truth leaks in small ways, and I feared for Brenda's privacy and the family's Raven had quietly protected. In those days I discovered the subtle architecture of mercy. It required both legal rigor and small human acts. I wrote down a schedule of who would be told when and the supports in place. I thought of inheritance as a shape that must account for feelings as well as facts. There is no neat way to reconcile blood with belonging. There is only a careful labor of truth that tries to keep dignity intact. But I resolved to choose compassion over spectacle, every single difficult step forward now. When Ben walked in wearing work boots, the room shifted as if the floor had rearranged itself. He looked like someone who belonged to the ground. Calloused hands, a foreman's tan, quiet eyes that measured things by consequence rather than applause. I had invited him under a pretext. Jones and I needed a way to bring someone we suspected into the room without theater. He gave a routine update about timelines and crews, but he named people when he spoke and those names landed like small, human anchors amid legalese. Jones later asked Ben to consent to a voluntary sample. I remember the way Ben nodded, careful, practical, and signed the form without spectacle. Waiting for lab results is a peculiar kind of endurance. You hold life in suspension until the paper speaks. During the wait I found reasons to speak with him. About projects, about safety margins, about the way he managed men who relied on the meals the crew brought home. He listened like a man who kept lists in his head and honored them. When the report came, Jones placed it on the table. The numbers were not theatrical. They were decisive. Ben was my biological son. The room did not explode. It breathed slowly as if all had been paused and then allowed to continue. Ben looked at me with a face asking permission to understand what kin meant now. I felt a looseness in my chest, relief braided with guilt for secrets kept so long. Ben's first question was practical. What would this mean for the crews and the projects he led? He spoke as if inheritance was a set of responsibilities, not privileges. He did not rush to titles. He worried about men who would lose wages if schedules shifted, and he asked how his acceptance of a name could avoid harming them. That answer revealed his character. He had the stubborn decency Raven once admired. Ashley's reaction was the opposite. A fury shaped by entitlement. He demanded counsel, legal motions, and immediate votes. The directors moved through procedure, some guarded, some relieved that clarity had arrived. Jude retreated. He chose absence as his defense. The spectacle Ashley wanted did not suit the work we did, and Jones navigated the legal steps with steady efficiency. I invited Ben to my office afterward and tried to be both father and steward. I told him Raven's story in the simplest terms I could. The hospital, the choice, the secret kept out of love. He absorbed the story without grand gestures. Tears formed, but his first practical thought was for the men he'd manage. He asked for time and for the chance to decide without pressure. I could not have asked for a more humane response. I contacted a trusted director to steady the room, told Miguel to document community impacts, and asked Jones for a modest public statement emphasizing continuity and compassion for everyone involved. I promised Ben and Brenda protection from gossip and an honest path forward together. Ashley left the boardroom in a fury, his composure unraveling into accusation and bluster. He had treated the company like an accounting ledger he could manipulate. The DNA report made that assumption impossible. He paced and shouted until security guided him out. A man who believed law would yield to force. Watching him go felt like watching a map burn. Brenda remained, not ranting but hollowed, alternating between pleading for explanation and accusing me of betrayal. She clung to memory and to the cedar box as if both might anchor her. Jude fled. Absence is often a chosen defense, and his disappearance said as much as any speech. Jones moved with legal efficiency. Sealed exhibits, formal will reading, and counsel present. Ashley pushed for injunctions, but once Raven's amendment and corroborating records lined up, his motions lost purchase. Directors who had been seduced by polished promises returned to the practical commitments Raven had made. We faced a new reality. Unwind contracts that had tilted toward Ashley's network and repair relationships with local vendors we had drifted from. That work was slow and required honesty, reassignments, audits, and offers to restore community partnerships. Miguel and Jill led the operational repair with a diligence that felt like medicine. Public exposure threatened everything. Jones issued a narrow statement to control the narrative. Operations continue. Personal matters will be resolved privately. It bought us breathing room, though rumors surfaced and a small news cycle nibbled at edges. I visited sites and tenants, reminding them our work continued despite family turmoil. The fallout produced granular tasks that ate at days. I spent mornings on procurement calls, tracing invoices back through months, unspooling a thread of preferential treatment that had emerged gradually. Men who had once risked their reputations for friendly contracts called with questions. Some were forgiven when explanations were honest, others required restitution. We rewrote procurement guidelines and introduced a review board that included community representatives. People Raven had always wanted near the table. These were not grand gestures. They were administrative acts that repaired trust slowly. At staff meetings, I told people we would preserve jobs and projects. I reminded supervisors that tenants mattered more than quarterly reports. The foreman nodded and returned to schedules. Their practical faith steadied me more than boardroom declarations. Brenda's recovery was not linear. Therapy sessions were raw and often private. She asked hard questions about identity and belonging. She slowly began to accept support without feeling its pity. I listened to her stories about childhood recitals and secret kindnesses Raven had arranged. These recollections humanized the facts we had revealed and began to stitch her life back together. Ashley's influence left practical complications. favored vendors, contracts needing review, and a culture frayed by envy. Restitution meant careful audits and a strategy to channel procurement back to the company's mission. We introduced governance changes to prevent single-family capture of corporate decisions and added safeguards for community interests. When Ashley's name receded from corridors, the company breathed a little more evenly. The work of restoration was practical, slow, and demanding. It asked me to keep choosing what Raven had taught. Protect people first, let the work speak, and govern with mercy rather than spectacle. On the morning after the chaos, Ben and I stood near the boardroom window and I realized how strange it felt to have someone else share my history. We looked out over the skyline Raven had watched for decades, a horizon of cranes and finished roofs and neighborhoods that still bore the names of families she had helped. Ben spoke quietly about a crew member who had lost a wife and how they had rallied to support him. His sense of responsibility was immediate and practical. When I asked him whether he wanted to accept a role in leadership, he did not answer with rhetorical gratitude. He asked stubborn, immediate questions about crews, timelines, and the men who would be affected by change. I told him about Raven, her small mercies, the ledger of favors she kept, and the way she refused a buyout that would have gutted affordable units. I told him the truth about the cedar box and why the secret had been kept. He listened without melodrama and then asked what his name would change. I told him it would mean a responsibility to uphold work and a chance to shape policy rather than just execute projects. He nodded and asked for time to speak with his team. We walked a project site together that afternoon. Men waved from scaffolding. A child rode a bicycle near a half-built playground. Ben's crew greeted him with respect that had nothing to do with titles. He had earned their trust. Watching him there, I felt the odd relief of recognition. Perhaps legacy is less about blood and more about the labor of care repeated day after day. We spent weeks integrating him gently. Jones formalized acknowledgments. We invited Ben to advisory meetings and asked him what governance changes might prevent the kind of capture Ashley had attempted. He suggested community seats on procurement panels and transparent vendor rotations. Practical, immediate fixes that reflected his field sensibility. The board listened and slowly agreed. Brenda's healing continued. She remained part of the company in a role that honored her talents and did not force a false ownership. She worked on community outreach and oversaw a fund Raven had once managed quietly. The change allowed her to rebuild identity around contributions rather than titles. It was not an easy transition, but it was honest. In board meetings, the tone shifted. We introduced a charter that prioritized community impact and required a rotating review of major contracts. The company instituted an ombuds program for employees and tenants to report concerns directly. These were practical changes born from a painful lesson, and they began to tilt the culture back toward the purpose Raven had insisted on. On quieter evenings, Ben and I met at the construction yard and spoke without witnesses. He told stories of his adoptive parents, two people who had taught him the dignity of steady work, and I told him about fatherhood I had never imagined. He sought to do the work better. That humility made me proud in a way names on paper never did. The season changed. Scaffolding came down and neighborhoods filled with life. The company did not become perfect, but it regained a moral axis. I often stood near the window and thought of Raven, and how her flawed mercy had created both rupture and repair. When I spoke at a small gathering to mark a project completion, I said simply that legacy is a ledger of choices, not merely an heirloom. Ben stood beside me and, for the first time, placed his hand on my shoulder. It felt like approval, not claim. Raven's secret had written an ending for one chapter and a beginning for another, and in the quiet aftermath I learned that forgiveness and stewardship can rebuild what secrecy almost destroyed. Legacy, to me, is no longer about wealth, titles, or bloodlines. It's about the choices we make each day, the lives we touch, the dignity we preserve, and the values we protect long after we're gone. Raven taught me that legacy is a living thing, built in kindness and carried in responsibility. It isn't just what we leave behind, but how what we leave continues to serve others. Now I'd like to hear from you. After hearing this story, what does legacy mean to you? How would you define it? Not in terms of inheritance, but in the impact one life can have on another. Share your perspective and take in the comments below. I'd love to know how you see legacy shaping the world around you.